Walking into an arcade as a kid is a magical experience, something unrivaled by anything except perhaps meeting a Disney character or petting a dog. It's right up there at the top. When you walk into the arcade, past the food vendors, the token machines, and walk into the darker areas, lit only by the reflections of the screens and flashing lights on the machines, it can be overwhelming deciding what game you want to play. Where should you spend your money? In the back, a bank of machines, 2 or maybe 4 of them strung together against the wall. These machines have seats and racing wheels and take up a huge amount of space. They're loud, they move, there's flashing lights everywhere, and groups of people playing together, against each other, but still together. It's hardly a surprise why these arcade-style racing games became so very popular. And even less surprising why gamers who grew up experiencing that and then losing it as arcades became less and less accessible, why they might decide to support someone who promised to bring that feeling back. This video tells the story of one of those games, and the company who took advantage of its shortcut to nostalgia and abused it. This is the story of the man who would destroy a game, who would promise to drive it to greater heights, but instead crashed it into a wall and left it to burn. As with many stories, it starts with a beginning, and this one is somewhat happy. Nicalis is a company that you might never have heard of, but it's likely you've heard of their games. Starting with Cave Story in 2010 and following it with V and Night Sky in 2011, Nicalis was an indie darling. And when they published The Binding of Isaac, they became members of indie royalty. Nicalis was a successful multi-release indie developer and publisher, and that's basically a unicorn in the industry, so it not only garnered attention, but became a leader in the space. Nicalis used this leadership position to great effect, primarily through the hands of their CEO and founder, Tyrone Rodriguez. There are anecdotes about Tyrone purchasing Switch development kits, literally as many as Nintendo would agree to sell, and then giving them to partners so that Nicalis and their friends could be at the forefront of the Switch eShop. Nicalis became one of the go-tos for indie Nintendo publishing, something incredibly valuable to a developer who simply can't get Nintendo on the phone. Nicalis is a love-it-hate-it company. When they do right by their fans, or when they release a title that fans are excited for, they get a lot of adoration. This is part of that indie darling effect, and it drowns out a lot of the negative voices. Cave Story and Binding of Isaac were huge successes, and Nicalis absolutely pounced on that, releasing Cave Story Plus, and Cave Story 3D onto 15 different platforms, and releasing The Binding of Isaac, Rebirth, Afterbirth, and Afterbirth Plus onto 8 different platforms, not including the various merchandising deals like the Binding of Isaac card game, 4 Souls, and Cave Story cameos in games like Terraria, and that's still not even talking about the fully fleshed out physical editions. Complaints get drowned out, and it's easy for a bystander to look and assume something isn't Nicalis' fault, in spite of some pretty clear trends. The cycle is simple. Announce a title, go radio silent for years, and then either release nothing or release silently. Whether this is done to meet contractual obligations or some other unknown purpose, the end result is the same. The game is not a success. From Redout, which was announced in a pre-order link through Amazon and then 2 years later was quietly released onto the European eShop, the physical edition having been disappeared from Amazon, to games like Juxt, which never received a release due to Tyrone's claim of needing a lot more work, even though it had already received an ESRB rating, something a publisher usually doesn't submit until the game is ready for release. Sadly, this kind of failure to communicate, this culture of silence that pervades all of Nicalis' dealings, is not only limited to fans. Takumi Naramura, the director of Nagoro's La Mulana, tells a story about how he discovered his game had been cancelled thanks to a tweet from Tyrone, followed by an email sent from Nicalis' staff. In an interview with Nintendo Life, Naramura details how, even with weekly meetings, the game was unexpectedly cancelled, even after starting pre-orders on WiiWare. Nicalis' announcement would blame a lack of users in the WiiWare market, stating that there weren't any players left and games couldn't expect to sell and see any success. But this was after allowing Nagoro to work on DLC and prepare to port La Mulana from Japan into European and North American markets for almost 2 years. Quite frankly, regardless of the truth behind declining numbers on WiiWare in 2012, the way Tyrone handled his partners when it appeared there was no profit to be made from them is nothing short of disrespectful. La Mulana was published later in 2012 on WiiWare by another company based in Spain called Enjoy Up Games, after Nicalis completely ceased communications. Enjoy Up released from scratch in a matter of months, a fraction of the time Nicalis had already spent, and apparently were reasonably successful despite Tyrone's dire prophecies. In North America, Nicalis published Cave Story Plus for the 3DS. 2 years later, they tweeted that a new company would be handling the EU release, and in a NeoGAF post, Tyrone would lay blame on that delay and eventual handoff on Nintendo of Europe, and say they didn't make it easy to release in a timely manner in Europe. When it was pointed out to Tyrone that it had also taken 2 years for 1001 Spikes, a game written and produced by Tyrone, to release, his response was equally dismissive. "We did announce 1001 Spikes 2 years ago. We've remade the game from scratch. The original game, 1000 Spikes, was built on IG Maker and not a port." Dismissiveness is a key trait here. And once again, in the exact same NeoGAF post, Tyrone decided to make another excuse for another release. Gritenzia released with some glitches, as is fairly common with any game. But when asked why a specific game-ending glitch where simply entering one of the towns would crash the game was allowed through testing and into the production version of the game, Tyrone's response was exactly what you might imagine it would be after having heard some of his other responses. He blamed someone else, this time the vendor who handled QA testing. And if you think it's odd that Tyrone, the CEO and founder of the indie darling who is publishing these games, was on NeoGAF responding to anonymous posts on the internet, well, that becomes something of his MO. This establishes a trend with Nicalis, and specifically Tyrone Rodriguez, where Nicalis will announce something, then years will go by without any communication, followed by a series of excuses blaming the problems on vendors or Nintendo, and a series of backlashes from Tyrone to fans and reviewers on the internet. However, at least these games were actually released. Yatagarasu was a Japanese indie fighting game. Nicalis announced a 3DS version in 2012 and then went silent about it. Meanwhile, in August 2013, the original developer successfully crowdfunded an effort to further flesh out the game as Yatagarasu Attack on Cataclysm. That same month, in 2013, Nicalis then announced their port of the game would instead come to the PlayStation Vita, dropping 3DS as Legend of Raven. Attack on Cataclysm from the original developers released in July 2015. In a similar vein to their announcement of Legend of Raven, the month after Attack on Cataclysm released, Nicalis took to Twitter to announce that the game was also coming to Xbox One and PlayStation 4 when they ported it to North America. The trend is here. Nicalis signed a game and announced ports to several consoles, created conflicting marketing and renamed products, and then went completely silent. To this day, Nicalis has yet to talk about Legend of Raven anywhere outside of these two announcements. Find a game people are reasonably excited for. use your resources to bring those games into consoles they wouldn't have otherwise been able to get onto. Take a cut of the profits. It's a simple, almost meditative process of profiteering, harmless to everyone involved, helpful to most. The developer gets a game that's more profitable, played by more people, and more likely to be a bigger success. The gamer gets to play a unique and exciting indie game on their favorite consoles. Nicalis gets to expand their portfolio, become a little more popular, a little more darling, and make some money while they're doing it. Find a game, something people are excited for, from a developer who can't otherwise afford to make a bigger game, and make them an offer.
In early 2010, Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 1 was being shown to fans, and a very vocal crowd was not happy with it. The gameplay seemed clunky, the level design lacked flow, and it was disappointing stylistically. Simply put, many felt it was a disgrace to even call this game Sonic the Hedgehog 4. Sonic's fans are nothing if not dedicated though, and one day a fan project emerged called Sonic Fan Remix. This short demo brought Sonic's classic side-scrolling gameplay to the modern day with a 2.5D presentation and an acceptably accurate rendition of the way those old games played. While nowadays its art direction may seem very busy, at the time this fan project impressed, particularly when compared to the official article. And those comparisons were drawn immediately, with players wondering why a fan project with no budget could manage to get the feel of a classic Sonic game down pat more correctly than Sega's own game. The cherry on top is that Sonic Fan Remix was developed in Unity and, at least initially, largely put together by a single man. This man, going by the username Pelican13, managed to garner a lot of interest and good faith with the strength of this showing. While that project was a great vertical slice of what Pelican13 could have accomplished with a Sonic-like game, after some time had passed, he began crafting a different style of game focused on classic gaming speed. This sets the stage for the launch of the 90s Arcade Racers Kickstarter campaign a few weeks into 2013, put together by one Pelican13. Citing inspiration from classic games like Scud Racer, Daytona USA, and Indy 500, the project clearly aimed to be a love letter to a forgotten era of arcade gaming, with vehicles and track elements that wore their inspiration on their sleeve. This project was conceived during a time when numerous Kickstarter games banked on the notion that modern publishers wouldn't dare fund certain styles of projects, and smaller scale racing games such as this certainly fit the bill. The campaign went live on January 18, 2013, with an estimated release for December of that same year if it were to be successfully funded. The project went on to receive a respectable amount of support from genre enthusiasts and from those impressed by Pelican13's Sonic Fan Remix project, and things seemed to be on track for successful funding. An interesting development was announced on February 11, 2013, however. Indie publisher Nicalis was going to be distributing the game to online platforms alongside new targeted platforms to release on: iOS, Android, and Wii U. The attention Nicalis' involvement brought to the project, combined with the fact that Wii U owners were desperate for any content they could get their hands on, helped give the Kickstarter a renewed push. When all was said and done, their project was successfully funded by 700 backers who raised €16,039, a fair chunk more than the goal of $10,000. With a well-known publisher on board and a slew of slated platforms to release on, things were looking good for the 90s arcade racer. Updates throughout the year were less frequent than backers would have liked, though. As the year progressed, most of the posts made it a point to apologize for the lack of communication and promise to improve. But at the same time, a fair portion of the update posts were also dutifully talking about development progressing, whether it be how the racing courses were coming along, or to show off renders for the cars in the game, so most of the backers accepted the level of communication at first. The first major snag in the process, then, comes about on the first day of October, 8 months after the Kickstarter had successfully concluded. Beginning with yet another apology about the lack of communication, an update was posted on the Kickstarter by Pelican13, passing a message from Tyrone Rodriguez of Nicalis. This post shared that while they had been trying to achieve an arcade-style racing feel by altering an existing realistic driving simulation, they had to face the facts that it just wasn't working and didn't feel the way it needed to reach the desired effect. On the surface, this seemed like great news, showing that there was a sincere effort to make sure the gameplay hit the correct nostalgic notes, but taking a step back for perspective painted a different picture. The initial release date was intended to be December of 2013, but with just a couple months to go until the projected release date for the game, those developing it were only just now sharing details about how a critical aspect of the game was being reworked. And, with a characteristically late update one day before November would end, Pelican 13 confirmed that the game would not be hitting its estimated launch. The reason? Nicalis decided to target more platforms and was increasing the scope of the game. The update was accompanied with new footage showing the game environments. So far, though, nothing was out of the ordinary. Game development takes time, and particularly with a smaller team, sometimes things just take longer than expected. Most backers understood and patiently awaited further news. That news wouldn't come until a few days into February of 2014, months after the last update and a year after the Kickstarter ended, with a short post about how the Wii U version of the game was shaping up. It was shared that they were aiming for a mid-2014 release of the game, putting it about half a year past its initial release date, but still well within a reasonable time frame. In what was starting to become a worrying sign, another 3 months of silence passed, before Pelican 13 posted on May 7th, once again apologizing for said silence, but promising that there were a few good reasons why they'd been quiet. He went on to talk about some aspects of the game's audio and music, additionally promising to announce the game's first musician in a couple weeks. Spoiler, that musician was never announced, but ended with a stated ambition to see the game come to PlayStation 4, the PlayStation Vita, and Xbox One consoles after its PC and Wii U release. By now, the trend is probably becoming apparent. A few months of silence pass by, only to be broken with a promise that things are progressing and more is coming. By this point in the process, people were becoming wary of the cycle. There were slight updates over the next few months, one of which was just to advertise an unrelated Kickstarter, until the next bombshell on September 22nd, 2014. The game's art, design, and audio is pretty much complete and only in need of some polish, which means we are behind when it comes to code. We had some trouble mainly with the AI, and we had to scrap a lot of code and start fresh. Unfortunately for a small team like us, that means a few months of work and a delayed release date. Pelican 13 also added that it would be unwise to specify a new release date. The hits kept coming from here. December 4th, 2014, a new AI solution is discussed for the game's ongoing issues with its computer-controlled racers. January 23rd, 2015, the first new gameplay footage in a long time is shown, with no solid release date in sight. Nearly 4 more months passed with more silence, until a mega update was posted halfway through May, showing the largest look at the game with Wii U gameplay footage, layouts for each of the game's 9 tracks, and some images of the game's menus. By now, the game's backers were upset and mocking the project in the comments. With biting snark, people joked that they were eagerly awaiting the next vague update months later. They were more correct than they realized, with an update in September once again talking about how the project grew in scope. However, it ended with a significant factor. 2.5 years after the project was funded, Pelican 13 was offering refunds to displeased backers. And on November 1st, 2015, one final post was made. And even almost 4 years later, this is still the last official communication to the game's 700 backers via the official channels. This final update once again showed new gameplay footage accompanied by renders of the game's cars, but most importantly, Pelican 13 noted that development was coming to an end. He then provided a link to a new project he had been working on called The Takeover. In a similar vein to Sonic Fan Remix and the 90s arcade racer, it was also an homage to a Sega franchise, this time being Streets of Rage. For upset backers of the project, the 90s arcade racer's path was an arduous one. Months later, on March 20th, 2016, Pelican 13 posted in the Steam forums for The Takeover, telling a user that 90s arcade racer was still his priority and that a Kickstarter update would be coming soon. It never came. With a promise of refunds and a statement that the game was almost finished, those who were still keeping up with the game once more looked to the future with an exasperated sigh. Even with a textbook case of how not to manage a crowdfunding campaign, this project's luck would continue to spiral downward.
When a trend stops being a changing movement or tendency, it just becomes the status quo. It becomes normal. You aren't gaining a nasty habit, you just have one. Tyrone Rodriguez's nasty habit is lying. But the question is whether he's lying to himself because he believes the things he does, the road to hell being paved with good intentions and all, or whether he is malicious. Certainly, he is vindictive, and there is a level of inherent dishonesty in many of the interactions he has with the public, be it fans, developers, or reviewers. The Golden Bolt reviewed one of Nicalis' releases, Tiny Barbarian DX, a port of a PC game to Switch in 2017. In this, Bolt makes the argument that he felt the game was overpriced at $30 on the Switch, because it was available previously for $10 on Steam.
Simply put, I don't feel that Tiny Barbarian DX is worth that asking price of $29.99. When the game was released on Steam, it was $9.99, I'm given that was 4 years ago, but every single one of those 4 chapters the game has was promised for that $9.99 price. Yes, if you did buy the game already, you're entitled to get those 2 for free, and I'm sure you will, but it doesn't feel right to me that porting the game to a system tripled the price just for 2 extra DLC add-ons that were held back from the Steam version. To me, that just feels sketchy. Just talking 2D platformers on the Nintendo Switch alone, you can buy a game for less than $30 that does more, provides more choices for the player in doing more, and is simply put, a better game in Shovel Knight, and I'm just naming one example off the top of my head here. I really don't see what Tiny Barbarian does to stand out from the crowd.
As you heard, Bolt says he understands why it was increased, but that it wasn't worth the increase, especially not with other games also available on the Switch that provide more or better experiences for less cost. Tyrone saw this and began a Twitter spat. His entire rebuttal essentially amounting to, "It's always been $30 on the Switch," which is certainly true, but also highly intellectually dishonest. Of course it had. It was only just released on Switch. This is gaslighting or a false equivalence. It's not a lie, but it's dishonest nonetheless. Bolt's argument is simple, and Tyrone's response is something you can only understand if you're either willfully obtuse, refusing to understand the argument in the first place, or purposefully misleading with the intent to discredit the argument entirely. The sole motivator for which would be that Tyrone's company, Nicalis, had published the game. He is, in this case, at best, someone who would obfuscate bad business practices and trash talk a small creator, and that's literally the nicest thing you can say about him in this situation. The question remains as to whether Tyrone is doing this maliciously, or if he just does things because he thinks they would be a good idea. Similarly, the 90s arcade racer is a game that no longer exists. Nicalis changed the name to 90s Super GP at some point. No one's even entirely sure when this occurred, as the only information about it came out in 2017 when Nicalis announced that they would no longer be releasing 90s Super GP onto the Wii U. You might recall that 90s Arcade Super Racer GP had originally been planned for the Wii U, the PC, the Xbox One, the PS4, PlayStation Vita, iOS, and Android. Certainly following the exploitation trend of Nicalis, but when it was announced finally that the Wii U was no longer a targeted platform, Destructoid noticed that neither were most of the other platforms. Now, 90s Super GP was targeted for the Nintendo Switch, Steam, and PS4, dropping Xbox, Vita, and mobile with the Wii U cancellation. Imagine any high-profile Kickstarter game pulling this and receiving no backlash. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night also dropped their Vita port and made headlines on IGN, Polygon, Variety, US Gamer, Play Asia, and more and more. Admittedly, it's a larger game, but it also makes total sense why they would drop the Vita. Of course, it's the Vita. However, Nicalis punted just about every platform 90s Racer was backed for, including the Vita, changed the name of the game entirely with absolutely no communication from the publisher, nor any communication on the Kickstarter page, and yet no one, absolutely no one, seems willing to stand up and say Nicalis is a fraud, stealing the goodwill, abusing the nostalgia, and defrauding their status as indie darlings. And it's either because they want to improve their standing in the eyes of the public, and they're idiots, or worse, it's outright theft and fraud with regards to Kickstarter backer dollars. Again, though, no one will come out and say such a thing. This isn't even the end of this particular saga, because April 1st of this very year, 2019, Nicalis decided to play a joke. On April 1st, April Fool's, Nicalis posted this tweet. One of today's tweets is real. They followed this up with 3 other tweets. Introducing Cave Story, another Cave Story game, this time an RPG, Ikaruga Physical Edition on Switch, something many gamers would love to buy. And Super 90s GP is coming. 6 years after announcing they would be publishing 90s Racer, Nicalis uses April Fools to poke fun at the fact that they haven't released any information to the people who paid them. Kickstarter isn't an investment, it's not a purchase, but it's not a raffle either. You're not throwing money into a lottery with an astronomically high chance you'll receive a product. It's supposed to be a way to support things before they're released and get them slightly cheaper. And we all know there's risks involved. But to use April Fools as the way to poke fun at your own dereliction of management, your own failure to produce, isn't funny. It's disrespectful. Nintendo World Report reported on this information. Nicalis blacklisted them from receiving review copies of upcoming games. This April Fool's tweet is what put in motion this video you're watching as we speak. Much like Nicalis, we took months to respond. However, in something of a serendipitous occasion, Nicalis is back in the news. While working on this video, Kotaku released an article about Nicalis, which doesn't name 90s Racer explicitly, but paints a picture of what happened internally. While we will probably never know what happened to 90s, we know. Jason Schreier from Kotaku released an article September 12, 2019. In this article is detailed how Tyrone Rodriguez repeatedly ghosted developers in the middle of discussions regarding publication. Tyrone made a nasty habit out of entering into discussions with the developer and then simply never responding. Months would go by before he would respond with an excuse, blaming something else. Jason lightly mentions the same NeoGAF article we talked about earlier, and then goes into leaked logs and anecdotal evidence that Tyrone engaged in extreme racism, slurs, anti-Semitism, forced employees to drink and engage in long parties and social activities with him or risk being fired, engaged in deceptive negotiation practices by encouraging partners to drink heavily while refusing to drink himself, and then setting up deals based on those negotiations with partners who were under the influence. The level of power advantage that Tyrone would take over his employees is stark and shocking. I can't even show you the logs of his chat without seriously risking this video being blocked, but I can read you an anecdote from Game Bakers, the developers of Fury. In 2017, they wanted to port their boss battling gauntlet game Fury to Switch, and started talking to Nicalis about putting together a port as quickly as possible. It was important to strike early. They knew that within the next year or two, the Switch eShop would be oversaturated with indie games and that getting noticed would be tough. We sent the project, they evaluated the cost, sent a first contract draft that we sent back with changes, said the Game Bakers co-founder Audrey LaPrince in an email. But then they started ghosting us, not answering emails, Skype calls. We waited 3 weeks, tried to contact them several times. Finally, they answered that they were sorry and would send us a mail the next week. Time passed. We were going to E3. They were there, offered to see them there. We reminded them how acting fast was important, so eventually we sent a message saying the deal was off, considering the communication breakdown. LaPrince added that they didn't lose any money, only a few months of potential sales. Annoying, but not a major deal. And that they did eventually release the game on Switch in January 2018 without Nicalis. We thought they must have had good reasons on their side. It's not always easy, she said. But considering the problems we heard from other developers, we are starting to think we were not the only unlucky ones. There's a lot more, but the gist of the story is Tyrone is a liar. But it's not clear if he's lying to himself and taking on more than he can manage, or if he's just a malicious fool. Is he the type of person to ghost a developer, tie them up for years with contracts, and let a game die? Is he the type to throw a developer and a game away when it doesn't look profitable anymore? Would he leave a burning car, slowly incinerating into a burnt husk on the side of the road?
The 90s arcade racer was merely yet another victim of Tyrone's bizarrely incompetent work ethic. To this day, the game's name change, projected platform shifts, and years of silence have yet to be elaborated on or explained, whether it be to backers of the project or even just anyone, period. A few days before the Kotaku article broke, Tyrone shared the first tangible news of this game in years to a random person on Twitter by stating it would have online play and claiming that he's still working closely with Pelican 13 on the game. If they're still working so closely together, why have there been 4 years of silence on the Kickstarter? Tyrone doesn't have Pelican 13's Kickstarter login, obviously, but surely the message could have been passed through Pelican 13 as it had been so many times before. No press release was ever given from 2015 onward explaining or even attempting to spin anything that had transpired with the project. Nicalis' own website happily touts the game as 90s Super GP, but no matter how many pleading tweets or emails I and many others have sent to Nicalis, there's just never been any response. Pelican 13 got a bad rap through most of the project's existence from its backers, but hindsight is 2020 and the clearer story seems easy to surmise now. Nicalis used to be a name many knew fondly, publishing niche indie hits and generally having a great reputation on the surface. It seems that with the 90s arcade racer, a budding game designer with a promising niche title was taken advantage of and left out to dry with his reputation destroyed for years, all while Nicalis kept a great image in the public eye. When Nicalis became the publisher, they became the owner of the 90s arcade racer. With that in mind, it's not a stretch to guess that legal concerns and struggles have forced Pelican 13 to remain silent on the matter ever since, with him having to forge ahead working on the takeover and probably just hoping for the best. While it's doubtful to assume he's entirely blameless in all of this, he seems far from the major cause of this game's downfall. With Tyrone's terrible practices exposed by Kotaku and his own silence since the article was published, more than ever it is now unclear where the project stands. A build of the game was at Anime Expo this year, taking place in July, a fact marketed so poorly that I didn't even know the game was being shown until a friend of mine posted on Reset Era that she had played the game. The picture she paints is grim. Absolute garbage. It's not even a racing game anymore. Your final position is determined by points you get for drifting. The AI is laughable. They drive seemingly random racing lines all over the track with no real direction. The person demoing it on the show floor didn't seem very proud and was actively avoiding answering questions. When I messaged her to make sure she was okay with her experience being mentioned in this video, she shared with me that she probably could have been even harsher about the game's quality in her post than she had been. 6 years past its initial release date, one that was missed to help focus on the game's AI, it seems there's still a lot of work to be done. In the time since this project was funded, Sega themselves beat those involved to the punch by doing what seemed unthinkable in 2013, releasing a brand new Daytona USA arcade game to the world. At this point, I feel everyone involved on the development side of this game should just cut their losses and officially scrap this project. Realistically, however, it's much more likely that Tyrone and Nicalis will hold this project hostage for a few more years and then unceremoniously release it to no fanfare in a scenario where no one wins. They won't recoup their investment, Kickstarter backers won't receive the game for the platforms they chose it for, and racing game enthusiasts will have yet another clunker to avoid. Ironically, what started out as a charmingly simple love letter to 90s gaming nostalgia managed to crash headfirst into a nightmare scenario, one that only the modern gaming landscape could provide.
It's clear to me that Tyrone is the problem here. He's a bigot, a terrible manager, an egotist, and a dumb one. He's a liar and a fraud. Tyrone needs to retire, and Nicalis needs a new manager. Sadly, I think Mykonos is correct. 90s Racer is dead. A lot of time and effort goes into researching and writing these videos, and if you've made it this far, you probably appreciate that. The kindest thing you can do is share this video with others on Facebook, Twitter, or Reddit so that more people can watch it, because it really helps us out. On this video, I was kindly joined by Mykonos Fan, and you should check out his content linked in the description.
Hi, I'm Mykonos Fan, and I'm one of the 700 backers who helped fund the 90s Arcade Racer. This game has been my white whale for years, and I really appreciate Crymore Gaming for letting me hijack their channel to talk about this disaster of a project. If you like my voice and want to hear us speak about other Sega games and other indie games, feel free to swing on by my channel sometime.
If you'd like to watch another video about gaming history, you can watch one in the corner right now, and as always, we'll see you on the next one.